Welcome to the Hosea 4 Bird 6 podcast. I have a special guest with me. He is a clinicianal social work scholar, therapist, and educator whose career bridges research, teachings, and practices in race, identity, and social justice. Born in Costa Rica and raised in Boston Dorchester's neighborhood before entering Meco's busing programs. He went to earn a PhD in psychology from Wesleyan University, pursued graduate studies in philosophy at the University of Chicago, and completed both a Master of Social Work at Boston University and a PhD in social work at Simmons College. As a licensed independent clinical social worker, he has held faculty positions at Will Lock College, where he designed core dynamics of oppression and privilege courses, as well as at Simmons College, Wesleyan College, and Boston University. In K-12 settings, he served as an associate dean of students of Phillips Academic and led equity and inclusion initiatives at Chestnut Hill School and Belmont Day School. He's the author of The Arc of a Bad Idea, Understanding and Transcending Race, and numerous peer-reviewed articles on spirituality, racism, pedagogy, and cultural competence. In every role, presenter, writer, clinician, he combines rigorous scholarships with experimental learning, guiding individuals and organizations to move beyond race towards a more inclusive ways of relating. Did I get you in that good bio? This is Dr. Carlos Hoyt.
Well, thank you. That's a very, very generous rundown of my sounding like a pretty long life, but I guess that's a good thing.
No, I mean you did a lot of things, and I'm very impressed. When I was reading through your bio, I was very impressed about the work that you did. And the reason why I'm very impressed with the work that you did is that every degree that you got confirmed that you have mastered the ability to pattern recognition in that particular subject, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of saying it. I actually have felt for a long time super fortunate that I've been able to sort of fall into that sequence and sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Gestalt, of
Okay.
different sort of perspectives that are all they're kind of around the same thing. So everything feeds everything else, and it does help to sort of deepen and widen anything I happen to be doing, whether it's writing or research or workshops or whatever it might be, or my private practice in psychotherapy. So I feel super
Yeah.
fortunate about that.
What drove your passion to go into philosophy, to go into social work? Because they're interconnected in a way, but what drove that passion to go into those fields?
Yeah, I think they are interconnected. I I left high school, I think sort of leaning towards what would become an interest in the discipline of philosophy. I
Yeah.
was lucky enough to, have been straddling cultures, from the time I was 4 years old, having landed in Dorchester from Costa Rica, and watching my very Costa Rican parents, adjust to this uh, country's views on social identity and race and all of that. Being identified myself as, a quote unquote black male
Yeah.
in this country, going home and having my Costa Rican roots. And like from the very beginning, like started feeling that a lot of the stuff was what we call these days sort of social constructs. There was nothing sort of bone deep or super transcendent about any of it. It was how people tended to think about each other. And then realizing some of the results of all of that. Sometimes positive for some people, sometimes lethally negative for other people. And
Yeah.
I think I was just wondering about that for a long, long time. I think the wondering became intense when I got to leave my Dorchester neighborhood, where pretty much everybody looked like me,
Yeah.
and starting in seventh grade, being a place where almost nobody looked like me.
Mm.
Luckily, those years were all constructive and all positive. So instead of coming out with, any kind of trauma, that sometimes happens when people have to switch cultures, I was really afforded the opportunity to just sort of study, what it was like to leave a place like Dorchester, at 5:30 in the morning, end up in a place like Dover, Massachusetts, an hour or so later, spend time there academically, socially, come back home again, and get a real experiential sense of, it's nothing essential about the people, it's about the circumstance. that we find each
Absolutely.
other in.
Yeah. I
So I think
realized
that that sort of spurred the philosophy, the sense, the wanting to understand, like, why is it that people do this stuff to each other?
yeah. Yeah. I got 2 points coming from there, man. Because I come from Brooklyn, New York, and it's Flatbush, and it's a very it's an immigrant centered, impoverished neighborhood. And I moved to Massachusetts towards like a middle class area, and I saw like the difference in behavior. Um, and that's what I started to realize, like, oh, like because I've been into two different atmospheres or two different areas, that people I realized that people think different based off where they live. Their
Yeah,
environment dictate their identity, and their identity dictate their behavior. And the crazy thing is, the behavior comes back around to influence the environment.
that's exactly right.
But the first thing is you have to change the mindset um, of the identity. Now, I've been going through your work a little bit, like, and I realize that a lot of times when people are having a conversation about your work, they're either thinking that you're trying to eradicate race. What I really think that you're trying to do is you're trying to reimagine race.
Yeah, thanks for having what I've come to learn in our short interactions is a very keen, and
Yes.
open-minded viewer. So thanks for that. I laugh because, from the start, when I had opportunities to talk about what are some unorthodox views on race and racism and racialization, I've gotten used to people's eyebrows going way up at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then if they have just a little bit of an open mind and critical thinking, their eyebrows come back down and they realize I'm not saying anything harmfully radical. It's just in terms of the norm of how we discuss it, radical. So yeah, it's not. Is it about getting rid of race? I think for me, it's a bad question. It's tempting because, one can jump in and say, yeah, that's what we should do.
Yeah.
But that would be like, getting rid of the idea that some people still think the earth is flat. Like, maybe some people do, maybe they don't. That's not what matters. We can imagine
Yeah.
all sorts of things. The question is, what's underneath the things we think, especially those things that drive our behavior and our opportunities and sometimes our frictions. And we know that race is a very young concept, on this planet. I'll give it 500 years, as we talk about it today. That's not a very long time in the history of human beings. We know that our country was pivotal, if not the crucible, of getting serious about this idea of separating people by race.
Yeah.
And we know that by virtue of reclaiming, and people having to respond to being literally hunted down and killed on the basis of being racialized, they responded in kind, and tried to claim it back and make it something positive. And I sometimes say, with as much compassion and understanding as I can, that
Yeah.
that's a very understandable impulse. But I do wish that instead of reclaiming, we would have disclaimed the whole bad idea,
Yeah.
that, there are no races. Therefore, the idea of you thinking that I'm inferior based on race, like, makes zero sense.
Yeah.
But, we didn't have the information back then that we have now. So we're in this very, very challenging place where there's so much stake, in the idea of racial identity, that to say it's just going to disappear in any moment, that's probably not going to happen. So I encourage people to know what's behind it and then make your decisions about what you do with that. Because a lot of people just don't, and they're still under the illusion that there is something biological, essentially different, about people that are racialized in different ways. And that essentialization, keeps us from managing the whole concept differently.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Because Johann Blumenbach, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, the German um anthropologist who created the concept of race, he did not mean it to be a social hierarchy. He wanted to classify people like he classified animals and plants. But then it got co-opted and then it turned into this hierarchical form because of the economic prosperity that could have happened in America, because white people saw an advantage of, like, we need to have this bottom class of people that's going to make this generating money that's going to elevate the upper class, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, the origin of race sort of has several tributaries, that combine to result in where we are now. Some of them were, basic human curiosity.
Yeah.
There came a point where people were traveling far enough away from where they come from that they were running into people who didn't look like them anymore, right?
Yeah.
And that raises an obvious human question like, what is this version of this thing that kind of looks like me? And then the
Absolutely.
mind goes where it goes, right? We see difference, it's superficial, we start to attribute things to those superficial differences. And that can just look like, almost like what a child would do as they move through the world and see differences, right? It can feel a little bit innocent. But as you say, that didn't last very long. If there was anything innocent about it, it soon became how can we monetize this? How can we capitalize on this? How can we leverage this to keep
Absolutely.
a group of people that we need for labor, to give us the stuff we want in a labor position forever, right?
Yeah. So I mean, my background is I'm Haitian from Flatbush, but what I realize is how because of this racial history in America that's been passed down for generations. Um, I grew up in a neighborhood that even though I wasn't like my family isn't formally African American, I started to adopt the African American and black title.
That's right.
And then what ends up happening is my behaviors tend to fall into those categories, right? But then what I realize is when I get into, like, I mean, I get into organizations that are like white dominant, right? I realize that those behaviors don't match the white dominant spaces that exist, right? And I know that this is what DEI wants to do is they want to include all cultures, but if my culture where I come from is seen as mild behavior to the dominant culture, how could those two ideas exist in the same space? Wouldn't some individuals have to make a sacrifice in order for the system to continue?
It's a great question. I think one of the questions you posed and the thing that you sent me quite a while back, so thank you for being so advanced and sharing that with me,
Yeah,
was like, is there a way,
yeah,
for us to find a way, to find some common ground? And in talking about DEI, obviously we're in a moment where there's just a whole lot of pretextual, sort of concern about DEI coming
yeah,
out of Washington and all. I mean, it's all nonsense just to get rid of anything that might be threatening to the maintaining of certain people's power.
yeah.
But I do think in terms of DEI, even apart from that, we still haven't achieved a very clear understanding of what DEI is and should be about. And in a nutshell, and slow me down or interrupt me if I'm sort of speaking too quickly about this, I think a lot of people believe that DEI is simply about, trying to make the world better for people who have been subjugated.
Mm,
And what DEI is, in my view, is simply a recognition of that any human social interaction, whether it's between two people or millions of people, a club or a
yeah,
country, it's about how do we manage three things: diversity, of background, thought, etc. And then once that's in place, what kind of measures should we put in place in terms of equity and inclusion to make sure that people get along?
mm,
Now, we can manage that two ways. We can be expansivist in our DEI goals. We can say we want to be as open and caring about any kind of human being who's behaving, properly, and we have to define that too. And we want to go as far as we can with that. There are some ways in which the very U.S. Constitution sort of aspires to that. It's complicated and it doesn't do it perfectly, obviously.
yeah,
Or we can be restrictivist, right? We can say, we're going to limit allowable diversity to these kinds of people. And then within those kind of people, we're going to give goods and resources and privileges to this particular elite group over here. And
yeah,
that has happened too in US history and obviously is happening now in spades. So I think the way to do it is to say, here's, a young person from Flatbush in Haiti, and when that person shows up in X, Y, and Z context, boy, their behavior looks a bit different than when these people show up in that context. What do we care about when it comes down to behavior that is safe, maybe joyful, constructive, and how can we make sure anybody who's coming in, to be part of our little world gets that and without losing their authenticity also maintains this sort of sense of at least we all agree on this. And I think that's
yeah.
what's missing, right?
So it goes back to what America. I forgot America's slogan, but it's basically out of many there's one. I
That's
forgot the
right.
Latin.
Pluribus unum, yeah, yeah.
Yes, it's out of many there's one, and you're saying that we have to redefine the acceptable behaviors so that we can work together.
Yeah, and I think we have to do that constantly, right?
Yes. Okay.
Because although we tend to want to, again, essentialize what diversity means, like people change all the time, right?
Mhm.
They change generationally, they change across generations, and
Yeah.
they change contextually. So if we're always trying to, one, allow for individual difference, but also maintain whatever parameters will keep everybody safe, then that's the tension, right? How do we manage that tension constantly?
Yeah.
So e pluribus unum, I think that out of many, one is kind of neat, it's a pithy little aphorism, but we have to
Yeah.
define one, right? If one
Yes.
means just one right way that I get to define, then I
Hmm.
think we're in trouble. But if one means one set, of moral and ethical aspirations that we're always striving towards, then we're working on something, right? And I do
Absolutely.
think, again, in some ways, the Constitution anticipated that, like we can make amendments, etc.
Hmm.
In other ways, the Constitution also, includes its own self-destruct mechanisms, because it
Yeah.
allows tyrants, to be elected into office and almost undo some of the good parts of the document.
Yeah. Now, my question is to those pirates, because you're speaking of Donald Trump. Are you speaking directly?
In this particular moment, yes, I think
Yeah.
American history has been, sort of punctuated, by these moments. Donald
Yeah.
Trump is the current, sort of striking iteration of what's
Yeah.
possible in a democracy that allows popularity, without any other metrics or qualifications, to
Yeah.
drive who gets to be in power. But yeah, that is what I'm speaking to.
Now, because his the reason for because I read an article that you had posted on your website, and it said that Trump's reason for getting rid of DEI or pushing institutions to get rid of DEI is because of the fact that it's driving national division.
That's what Trump says, but that's a
That's what Trump
pretext.
says.
Right,
Yes.
because in one of my rants online, I say
Mm,
that Trump is the DEI commander in chief, right?
mm,
The the rhetoric is that he is against DEI, and he's not. He's against expansive DEI, right?
yes.
But he's the architect of restrictive DEI. I mean, that's what it
Mm,
means, to send certain people away from this place and accept others, right?
yeah.
If you're from X, Y, and Z countries, forget it. If you're from South Africa, of all places, come on in. So
Yeah.
it's not that he's not working DEI, he is. It's just that
Yeah.
his policies are there to promote and preserve and protect a very small sliver, of humanity.
Yeah.
So instead of having to account for why
Hmm.
you're making these choices, he can hide behind, oh, DEI is a bad thing, right? But what he is a bigot, right? And what he's
Yeah.
promoting is bigotry. And nobody is saying to him, what makes it okay for you to do this? Right? Instead, the journalists, and everybody else just talk about this fight about DEI. And I have to give it to them. They're clever. They put up these smoke screens and like people don't penetrate them. And it's a
Yeah.
shame.
So my question it's kind of a devil's advocate because if let's just say because these institutions do influence minds and institutions like the media, the schools, they influence minds. If the institutions aren't teaching people to go into the real world and like what we said in one of those meetings and separate your beliefs with the survival, right? If they don't if they're not teaching that to be open minded, even if it's a supporter on the right or the left, and would like won't they be constant tension between the individuals who come from these institutions who are getting these beliefs but they're not separating their information from their survival, and they're just coming into the world, and when they interact with people because that person has a different belief than them, they automatically get frustrated or like they're disagreeable.
Well, that's exactly right. I think that sadly, too much of what we call school and education does sort of convey a kind of indoctrination. Um,
Yeah,
and I think when it comes down to, this is our school, these are our basic norms, these are our traditions and all that, some of that is perfectly okay. Some of it is innocuous, some of it is necessary in terms of behavioral norms anyway. But beyond that, what makes us better than the other school, the other town, the other country, what makes us exceptional and isn't it essential to who we are?
yeah,
That's when we start to fall down. Instead of appreciating that kids, especially the younger they are little philosophers. And if we can just give them a chance to think and see what's happening, they'll probably come to some good decisions. So, how to think versus what to think, I think, is really important. The history of philosophies, principles, programs that govern what civilization has been, could be, is right now. That's what
yeah,
we should teach as far as I'm concerned. And then ask the question, which way do you lean? Are you expansivist or are you restrictivist? If you're restrictivist, you realize that that will never work because at some point the people you're restricting are going to come back and restrict you. So really
yeah.
the only way to preserve civilization is to do the very best we can to be expansivist. Right?
Mm, okay, that makes sense. And that's to like I teach to my kids all the time. Like you got to continue learning. Like learning is not something that's something that you just stop doing after you get an education.
Well, that's
Something that
exactly
you
right.
continue.
Yeah, and we should teach how to keep doing that.
Yeah,
I've realized that, throughout my educational career, particularly once I got to college, like there's the curriculum, that you get exposed to, and what a privilege for those of us who get that. And then there's
yeah,
all, well, for me anyway, all the stuff you learn outside of that, right? Because something you read prompts your curiosity about something else, or something that seems to be missing in your curriculum prompts you to find out where it is, and you
yeah.
become autodidactic, right? You start being self-taught. And I think that's something that people can develop a really keen hunger for, and that we need to, especially in these times when information is packaged and there's echo chambers everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we can, and I'm sure you do this with your kids, emphasize critical thinking, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I teach a subject history where you have to, there's no you can't believe anything until you have concrete evidence.
Exactly, exactly.
And you have to have multiple evidence to validate your claim. You can't just make a claim and without any validation,
Well,
right?
that's exactly right. Yeah, and once you even know the facts to the extent that we can call them facts, then you have to say, like, what do we do with this?
Yeah,
Right. What does
because
it mean?
I was reading this guy from the 19th century, Nietzsche,
Mm-hmm.
and he speaks about how truth is evasive. It's like trying to lure a woman into your arms. He describes it as he describes it as it's constantly moving, which means that the framework in which you constantly search for truth has to be also elusive too, so you can capture truth.
Yeah, I've had the opportunity of reading Nietzsche. I haven't heard that particular
Yeah,
uh, sort of tool of his, but I'm not surprised that he said it. I
hmm
would, expand it beyond sort of the gendered thing and say that what I like about it is we do pursue things that are appealing to us, right?
hmm
And sometimes we find out that this thing we're trying to grasp doesn't want to be grasped, and what is
absolutely.
that about? It's
Yeah,
usually because we've projected our sense or our desire onto something that doesn't really, the map doesn't fit, and
yeah,
we're upset because the territory doesn't fit the map we drew for it. But to me, that's an invitation to say, oh, I better check myself in terms of my assumptions, my desires, my predilections, my leanings, etc., and really try to find out what's happening here on the ground, right? And then try to
absolutely,
match my behavior to that.
absolutely, and that goes into identity because what you believe to be true becomes your identity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's the trap that, you know, I work hard to invite people, one, to recognize, and then two, to avoid, or if they're in
Mm,
it, to, consider whether or not that's a place they want to stay. Because the
yeah,
idea of identity is not a bad thing. I think in some ways, personal identity is unavoidable. I need to
yeah,
walk through the world with a sense of who I am. Social identity is a different thing. Like that's a handful of categories, that society says you should fit into these things this way or that way. And we can't make that go away right now, but we can say, well, that stuff is not necessarily
Yeah.
what I want to be, right? I can resist what society says I need to be in terms of racialization, in terms of gender, in terms of all this stuff. And I can say, yeah, some of that's good, some of that's not. And I think people forget about their agency. And instead they say, well, if I'm this, I have to follow this script.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people in this group are going to say, I'm not being legit, or I'm not holding up my end, and I'm forgetting about solidarity or whatever it might be. And I think we have some work to do in that area.
To leave the micro space and go to the macro space, right? Um, I want to speak about social cohesion, and are you familiar with Emil Durkheim's work?
A little bit, yeah. I studied philosophy at
Yeah.
U Chicago for a year before I then came home back to Boston and became a social worker. But yeah, I mean, I really enjoy that stuff. I used to threaten my wife all the time. I'm going back and getting my PhD degree. But I never did.
Because Emil Durkheim speaks about a society sacred, the sacredness of in the society, and and reading history has, and coming from where I come from, and reading history has made me very practical about human beings and about civilization, right? And one of the things that Emily Durkheim speaks about with this sacred is that society has to have this one ideal that everyone aims for. And when you have a fragmentation in the society, it causes disunity. Um,
Yeah,
and that sacred for a long time in America has been Christianity.
yeah,
And what I realize now and through my research is that Christianity has decreased. There's more atheists, more agnostics. Even the people that follow Christianity don't even follow it to as strict as it used to be. And my biggest fear is moral decay within society. What is your perspective on that?
yeah. I think certainly Durkheim and folks of his era are to be understood or forgiven for couching things in terms of the sacred. Something
Mhm.
that's bigger, than us and sort of maybe above or beyond us a little bit that we can keep looking, to guide us. My translation, and I'll use a word that you use when you start talking about this, is we all need to, we would all do better, to appreciate a constellation of practical principles and parameters, that keep us from being at each other's throats.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not folks ground them in, religious views or spiritual views or agnostic views or atheistic views, to me, those things are crucially important to individuals, right? But I think for society writ large, as long as our different vehicles take us to the same destination,
Mm.
ride whatever vehicle you want. It's fine with me, right? And the destination, though, has to be, again, this expansivist aspiration that says we're not going to exclude somebody just because we think they belong to some category that essentializes their virtue, their worth, et cetera, et cetera. And whenever we
Mm.
have that impulse, we're going to resist it mightily so that we can simply be fair to people. Because there but for a change of circumstance go I. If I suddenly have the power to exclude these people and those people today, what if they get the same power tomorrow? Then we're just in the same kind of spin cycle we've been in forever.
Yeah. I get what you're saying. So what you're basically saying is that we have to make it non-negotiable against discrimination.
Well, I
It has
think
to
we
be
have to
non-negotiable.
see. I'm very much a pragmatist. I mean, I'm sort of adverse to labels in general, but maybe a secular humanist. But what I
Mhm.
want to say to people is there is no permanent, firm, inviolable, transcendental set of rules that we're supposed to follow. Because as soon as somebody says they have them, somebody else is going to say, nope, I have them over here, right?
Yeah.
So it's always up for grabs in some way. So what do we do, in a world where that's always going to be the case? What are the flexible, muscular sort of set of things that will keep a community, a country, and then this planet, from burning itself up, right?
Yeah.
That's what we need. It's almost like having a family, you know, and you have one kid and that kid amazes you. Then you have two kids and it's like, holy guacamole. Like they're so alike in some ways, they're so different in some ways. What are the general rules that I'm going to establish so that they can be their individual selves, but that they also know in this family, we do and we don't do some things,
Yeah.
right? And my poor kids who are now adults, they heard me say it all the time, like, we don't do that in this family, right? That's a boundary, right? Be yourself, you know, be really different, but there's a limit.
So you don't believe, because a lot of people kind of spin DEI as we're trying to get rid of this hierarchical structure. You believe that there still needs to be a hierarchical structure to enforce the set ideals to make sure nobody gets discriminated against.
Well, I won't dodge the question about hierarchy. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I sometimes offer people the metaphor, the imagery of being on an island, right? So let's say this is the island of civil society and things are going well there. Like the island is big, right? And it has an east side, a west side, a north, a south. You know, it has valleys, it has mountains. Like there are all sorts of dimensions on this island where people can live and live differently, right? But it also has a shoreline, right? And
Hmm.
let's say the shoreline sort of marks what's off island, right?
Yeah.
And we all understand that, you know, we can live together very nicely on this island, but if somebody wants to go and behave in a way that is off island, then we just have to mark it somehow. So that requires some kind of, I don't know, policing, to use a very charged word,
Yeah.
monitoring. Again, the same way we do it in a family or that you do it in your classroom. You know, there's some flexible, muscular boundaries that if people can say, yeah, I'll live within this, then their freedom, you know, suddenly gets some real definition. Because
Yeah.
I think freedom without constraints kind of doesn't make any sense. Like, where's the contrast? Where's the line, right?
That's chaos. Freedom without
That's
restraints is
chaos.
chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of hierarchy, I do think that it's helpful for one, everybody, you know, to have a common understanding and to self-monitor. You know, I think that positive peer pressure, you know, we all sort of share the same culture, so we help each other stay on the right side of things. And then, you know, because human beings are capable of doing amazingly wonderful things, but also amazingly harmful things, it's helpful to have, you know, some body of people who's well trained in compassion, but also limit setting, et cetera, et cetera. I worked in special needs settings for a long time, and the kids that I worked with, you know, for me, they were heroes, just that they showed up every day because these were kids who were told they were failures and just bad kids and they'd never be anything. And obviously, that's not true of them essentially. They did have behaviors they need to work on.
Yeah.
Um, you know, but they also needed help sometimes with their physical behavior. And I became a
Mhm.
trainer on physical restraint, you
Yeah.
know, and it's an amazing thing to allow oneself to use one's own body to control somebody else's body.
Yeah.
But this thing that we said to our kids all the time is after this, and this warning is that listen,
Yeah.
at some point, if you can't control your body in a safe way, somebody's gonna have to do it for you because we're not gonna let you hurt yourself. We're not gonna
Yeah.
let you hurt somebody else. We're not gonna let you destroy the building, right?
Absolutely.
So I do think, although that's very like, I guess in some ways, you know, authoritarian, it's in the service of something, and it's something we all know about. And it's not to exclude anybody; it's to keep people safe.
Yeah. And people, do you fear that in this DEI conversation that like people have to then get not get rid of, but they have to put a lot of their beliefs in the back burner to come to a central idea? Do you feel like in that DEI conversation there's going to be pushback because people might be like, well, I don't want to be with this person because he follows strict Christianity and Christianity says this.
Well, I have an article. Actually, the first chapter of the book I wrote most recently called "Diversity Without Divisiveness" talks about what DEI is and DEI isn't.
Yeah.
And what I say is, you know, we don't seem to realize that we're actually pretty good at being pluralistic and tolerant. Like you
Yeah.
can't actually leave your house without being ready to do that. Because
Absolutely.
let's say you're going to the supermarket, right? You're going to go up and down the aisles and pass people like who don't believe things that you do, right? And
Yeah.
who you would not have over to your house for dinner because you don't want to hear what they have to say about their beliefs. But in the
Yeah.
supermarket context, that kind of doesn't matter. Same
No.
thing when you go to a concert. Baseball game is a little bit different because you're fans of different teams, but you know what I mean. out in the world, in the public space, we're all pretty good, very good, I would say, actually, at tolerating differences. And we might even see them on people. This person's wearing a cross, this one's got a star on their shirt, this one's got whatever. So we do have cues that these people are different from us, but this is not the time or place for that to matter. It's not as relevant
Yeah.
because we're all there to enjoy the zoo, the theater, the opera, whatever it might be. So it's not that we don't know how to do that. It's just that we've become emboldened to say, like, if I think this person, isn't like me and I have the power, they're going to get a hard time from me. And
Yeah.
that's really unfortunate and unnecessary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That goes back to the education, right? You have to tell, and that goes back to what your work is. Your work is trying to tell people that this is just a construct. It's made up. Even though these ideas is being replicated by reality, we could change the replication based off what we think in our minds.
We could and we have to, otherwise we will stay trapped, in this really unfortunate and I think deadly dynamic, until the time something else comes and wipes us all out, if that's going to happen. It's funny, I've gotten to work with kids as young as 3 and 4,
Mm,
and it's amazing. It's not surprising, but it is amazing just how open-minded people are at that age. Like they haven't been corrupted, and their brains haven't been confined to this set of beliefs. What's a boy, what's a girl? Like, you ask these kids what they are in any given minute, they don't know and they don't care, right? But over time, society does sort of insist that we start to narrow and flatten, social identities, make choices about who belongs in the clubhouse and who doesn't, and then we're off and running. It's a shame.
okay. Now, I mean, if somebody comes to the space and be like, well, and this is just basically people that has criticism of DEI. If I come into a space and I don't want my kids being taught certain things, like and then other, because then again, what DEI focuses on is that it makes people have to be thinkers. Like you're pushing people to be educated and pushing people to be thinkers because you want everybody to attack every situation with understanding instead of judgment.
Well, that's exactly right. And I do think that at some point, maybe a gavel has to be banged. Are we going to do it this way or that way? Because
Yeah,
these are opposite directions. And I think that's inevitable that we have to ask that question. The answer to that question, what informs the answer, I think is what's important. And if the
yeah,
answer is we're going to do it this way because this maintains our power and privilege, then that's not an okay answer, right? If it's because this is what's going to make it possible for most people, in our setting to enjoy the same set of privileges, opportunities, et cetera, that is the answer, right? We're
yeah,
going to move expansively. So, to the folks who, and I write about this as well, who come in and say, well, if you're really going to be expansivist and be accepting, then accept my views. And my view is I don't want my child to be taught that there are more than two genders,
yeah,
right? So, and a lot of leaders and DEI people sort of like get paralyzed in that moment. It's like,
yeah,
oh, maybe they're right, but they're not right, because inclusivity can't be inclusive of exclusivity, right?
yeah,
What those people are asking for is a right to be bigoted, right? To exclude people who are different from them, but beyond that are not harmful in any way,
yeah,
right? There's nothing inherently harmful about not feeling like a boy or not feeling like a girl or not even being interested in the whole idea of gender. I can still go out into the world and be perfectly safe, be a lovely person, as a matter of fact.
yeah.
But if the only problem with it is that it doesn't match somebody's sense of, what people should be, that's not enough.
So to add to your point, to discuss your point about banging the gavel, because when you speak about banging the gavel, you're saying that there has to be a final judgment, right?
Well, it does. I mean, either we're going to
Yeah,
settle it with our fists, well, let's be as mild as we can. Either
yeah,
we're going to leave each other, because we
mhm,
can't get along and hope that there's enough space in the world for
yeah,
us to live the way we want to live without being
yeah,
bothered by each other. Or inevitably, we run into the fact of limited resources, limited space, limited security, and now we have to start sort of navigating and negotiating how do we share all this. Now, I think maybe small groups of people can work that out themselves, but I think, and I'm not saying I'm capital R right about this, But I think inevitably, there's going to have to be some, hopefully, duly elected and supported, power that's going to say, hey, remember what we said we'd do?
Yeah.
I'm here to sort of remind us of that.
Yeah. But the banging of the gavel is what I think is necessary, especially during this time, because of the fact that there are people that believe, like we saw Elon Musk and Donald Trump say, "Hey, now it's two genders,"
Hmm.
and then you have DEI that says there's an expansive of genders. Now, biologically, there is no two genders. There's just a spectrum, right? And we place people in these two genders because of socialization, and we want to maintain the social order, right? In a sense, that's what I'm hearing. Their argument is that they want to maintain the social order, by banging by banging the with the
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 gavel.
judge
Yeah.
there to make sure that people understand. Well, if we have these two genders, then we could maintain this country, because on the macro level, it's an anarchy in the world, right? Russia and China can still attack us, and we still have to maintain a strong solidarity in our country so that we could contest with the anarcho world that is Russia and China. I don't know if you get what I'm saying.
Well, I'll respond and you can tell me if I am or I'm
Yeah.
not. So, to the extent that that's a real existential threat and concern,
Hmm.
the question is, does whether or not we recognize that there are more than two genders have any impact on that existential concern? Now, somebody can say as a pretext it does, but it's not factually true. And I
Hmm.
will, just to put things in sort of my current language, it's not that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are saying there are only two genders and they're fighting against the fact that DEI says there's more than two. It's that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are pushing a kind of DEI which restricts the diversity of gender, right?
Hmm.
That's still DEI, that's the
Yeah.
diversity part. And they are providing a kind of equity and inclusion for only people who believe in that restricted sense of the D, the diversity.
Yeah.
So they are promoting DEI, and I just want to be clear on that, right?
Yes.
It's just super restrictive. DEI doesn't say anything about, whether or not there are two genders. Science does. Evidence does, right? We have people literally saying, "Hey, here I am. I don't believe, that just because I look like what you think is a boy, that I'm a boy. I am proof that there are people like that in the world, just like there are people like you who are happy to say that you are cisgendered, right? Why does the fact of your existence matter more than mine?"
Yeah.
So DEI, if it's doing well, is grounded in fact, right?
Yeah.
Diversity of human beings, just by walking through the world over generations, gives
Yeah.
us evidence that there are some people who don't sort of match their sense of self to the scripts of gender. Those are facts. Now, people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump and others, for a variety of reasons,
Yeah.
want to defy those facts. That's when we're in trouble. Because if everybody can defy facts, then anything goes. Right?
I think well, my point is more from a historical perspective, because it's because we know, because you said this that was very revealing to me. That's when I was like, oh, I like this guy a little bit, right? And you said every potential behavior existed in the past, right? But then for me being a historian, that is absolutely true. Every behavior existed in the past. But then what I realized, as society, as we got into civilization from the Paleolithic era to the Neolithic era, as the population expanded, right, we started to restrict behaviors to maintain society.
That's right.
And one of those things to maintain society was we assigned gender roles and we assigned gender identity,
Yeah,
right?
so imagine, since everything was possible and still is possible, it's just hard for people to see it. What if
Yes.
instead of saying we do need people to play different roles in society. We just need that labor-wise, right, to get it done. What if instead of saying, and therefore we're going to assign this hard work to these people,
Yeah.
this easy work and power to those people, and instead we said we're going to maintain as much equity, in the division of labor and the assigning of roles as possible. For example, to give a provocative example, instead of saying that, a Supreme Court justice is in that seat for life, we're going to laugh and say, that would be crazy. Why would we do that? There's so many wonderful people in this country, and how can we say how anybody's going to maintain themselves over a lifetime? Instead, and I'm just going to throw out a number here, 15 years, right? And after that, you go and do something else and we get somebody else in there because it simply isn't fair that such a small handful of human beings get to have that kind of power over decades, right, of the life of this country. So we didn't decide to do it that way. I'm betting somebody asked about it, when it was time to set that up, but their way didn't prevail. And instead, we have the ways that we have.
Got you. So you don't feel like um there's you don't feel like there's certain things that that we accept as society or behaviors that we accept as, I mean, you obviously think that there's behaviors that we could accept as society that will bring a society down.
I mean, down to a better sense of harmony,
No,
or you
down
mean destroy
to
it?
destroy it, because
Yeah,
that's the
I
component
think
that
we're in one of those moments right now.
you
Yeah.
think you're in one of those moments right now. Okay, got you.
Yeah, because we accept that, again, coming back to the Constitution,
Yeah.
it's okay for someone who, like, was really clear about it, is anti-democracy,
Hmm.
right? Wants to be king, is
Hmm.
against democratic ideals. We accept
Yeah.
that that kind of person can yet be promoted to the most powerful position in the country. Like, that to me, if it weren't so absurd and lethal, I'd say it's laughable,
Yeah.
right? But there it is, right? I mean, their qualifications to drive a motor vehicle, right? Where are the qualifications to be the most powerful person in the world? Other
Yeah.
than age and being a citizen of this country, like, where are they? It is
Yeah.
crazy to me.
Absolutely.
He
I
should have
mean,
been
yeah.
disqualified on the face of who he is and what he's done. And this is not even personal. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, what do you have to do to not be eligible to even run for an office here?
Yeah.
And because the way we think about those things is still rooted in social identity constructs, the big man, the powerful person, the charismatic whatever, whatever, the person who believes in what I believe in, like that's how we get in the kind of trouble we're in.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. I think there need to be some better guardrails so that society doesn't like go down, as you say, because it's going down right now.
Yeah, let's shift gears for a little bit. You also said something else that made me really like you. You said in one of our first DI meetings, you said that racism is wickedly ingenious.
Yeah.
Coming from, I mean, I call it. I mean, I come from Flatbush, but it's an impoverished neighborhood. Coming from Flatbush, I've seen the ingeniousness of racism, and I've seen the ingeniousness of racism because racism attacks the mind of an individual that comes from it, and it basically lessens the chances of them being or them moving up the social ladder, right? But that's from my perspective. You know what I mean? Going through it, seeing what I've seen in my neighborhood. But you're from Dorchester, which is also a low income area. What is your perspective on why did you label it wickedly ingenious?
Well, there are lots of reasons, and this isn't necessarily in order, but one is it distracts us, right? When
Okay.
we divide people, right, it means that the power that the people would have had, were they united in a struggle against something, is at least cut in half, and maybe even worse than that. Because as we know, there are divisions within races too, right? Um, Dark-skinned, black identified people, light-skinned, black identified people, rich, poor, et cetera, et cetera. Like these divisions do serve something. And
Yeah.
one of the things they serve is the maintenance of the status quo, right?
Mm.
So in Dorchester, we were the second black identified family in our neighborhood. It was actually a Jewish neighborhood when we moved in.
Oh
And it
wow.
was
Okay.
yeah, it was a moment of white flight. Real estate was doing the thing about redlining, et cetera. And over time, pretty rapidly, it went from being an all-white racialized Jewish neighborhood to an all-black racialized neighborhood. And the folks who moved in, wanted what all of us want for our families and our kids, to have a better life, good schools, et cetera, et cetera. But as the demographic of the place changed, so did the resources, so did the way it was policed, et cetera, to the point that ultimately my parents felt they had to move. It just became a dangerous place. Um, some of us, and I'm talking about my peer group, went to school in Boston for a while and then got into Medco or did different things. Some of us got in serious trouble. Some of us died. All the things that can happen in a neighborhood that is impoverished and where the conditions are such that sometimes violence is necessary and bad decisions can get made. And racism, like, creates those conditions and then benefits from it.
Yeah.
Because look, there are those people doing that stuff again, right? They can't manage themselves, they need to be policed in a different kind of way, et cetera, et cetera. Now, for me, in that same moment, that was the affirmative action moment. And I'm a beneficiary, right? As a kid who was doing okay in school, and I got a scholarship here and then this there, and that was helpful too. Um, I still have some discomfort about that because it was all from within the racial worldview. Um, and I think had none of that existed, I probably would have done okay. I like school and I do well in it. But it was all in the framework of here is a high achieving black boy, and we're in a moment in history where we need to do something about that to try to level the playing field.
Yeah.
You know, and I think all of that was unfortunate. Racism is ingenious, wickedly ingenious, in that one, it distracts us, as I just said, and two, like it's easy on the mind, right? If somebody looks like this, you can make assumptions about them. Those assumptions justify your behavior. Go live your life now, right? There's like hardly any thinking that you have to give into it.
Yeah.
Right? I was doing some research on the terrible part of American history, which wasn't very long ago, when not only were there lynchings, but there were picnics, right?
Yeah.
Like people brought their families, they dressed up, they brought little kids there, right? And the lesson was like it was easy. Like these people deserve this. It's okay. They're not really like us. They're not really people,
Yeah.
And if they have done whatever, look sideways at a white racialized girl, this is what they should get. It's a very easy lesson. Because if that's not true, then what I'm watching must be crazy. And my parents aren't crazy. Therefore, if they're telling me this, then those people must deserve this. It's a kind of almost savage, brute mentality that's so easy on the brain, but again, it's ingenious to me.
Yeah. That's deep. That's deep. Now, do you when we talk about me coming from where I come from and experiencing DEI, I often feel like we as people that come from my community, impoverished communities, and people that live in Dorchester, we're kind of left. Are we? Is it okay for me to say that we've been left out of DEI?
I Today is Thursday. On Monday and Tuesday, I did one of the like my favorite and most fulfilling things I get to do. I do a 2 day workshop with the Boston College Lynch Leadership Academy. The Lynch Leadership Academy is a source of preparation, guidance, training, for new and aspiring principals in the Boston area. So these are some of the folks who like give much of their blood, sweat, and tears to working with, kids like you and I were when you were Black in Flatbush and I was in Dorchester. And they're trying to make sure that kids like that don't get left behind, right?
Mm.
So on a macro level, I would say, yeah, as public school goes, folks in impoverished areas get left behind. They don't get the same resources I suddenly got just arriving in Dover that I didn't get when I was in Dorchester. In another way, I get to be up close and personal, with some leaders and administrators who are like trying their damnedest to make sure these kids aren't left behind. So yeah, it's an inequitable, unjust, corrupt, sort of a set of discrepancies between kids who just because of their circumstance don't get the same resources, love, care, opportunity, etc. that some other kids do just because they look different. When I was raising my kids, I worked in a special needs setting, so I went to school every day and I worked with kids of all different backgrounds, but what they had in common is that they were disenfranchised from useful education. They got kicked out of their schools, not because of them so much, but because the schools weren't ready to deal with them and they got sent to my school. Sometimes in the middle of the day, I would have to leave my school, Dearborn Academy, go over to Buckingham, Brown, and Nichols, where my own kids were going to school, to see this beautiful play, right? And enjoy these beautiful snacks and be on this beautiful ground, etc. And then I'd go back to finish the day at Dearborn. And it was head spinning because they're all kids, right? They all have potential, but because of their circumstances, they're likely going to have pretty different lives. And I just think that's awful. And I wish public school would do what it was built to, well, would do what it could be built to do, and that is make sure that everybody gets more or less a level playing field around those important years.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think in some ways, absolutely. Left behind, up against it, just put in a situation that's much harder than it needs to be. That
Yeah.
is why my parents took me out of Boston public schools, right?
Yeah. And the thing about those kids is that the society don't the society does not look at those kids and say, well, they had a bad hand. Let me give them a gesture. Like they have to go through the realities of the world just like everybody else, because everybody else is trying to survive and trying to get their own find their own way through the world. So they're like, I remember growing up, one of my friends said to me that it don't matter like if you got harassed by the police or you got a bad education or you didn't grow up with your father there, or you grew up in a crime filled area. Like the world still are looking for you to produce value.
Yeah, and it's a sober reality for too many people, but it's
Yeah.
also like so deeply unjust. When my kids were coming up in school, every now and then they had a lousy teacher, and my thing to them was, I'm sorry, you still have to find a way to learn, right? This is
Yeah.
life.
This is like,
For folks who grew up like you and me, like it's much more serious than that. It's not having a lousy teacher, it's
yeah.
who you have to fight, on the way to school, et cetera. It's not having a book that you need, et cetera, et cetera. And the other side, when my kids were at BB&N, like not only do they have nice resources, they have these networks, they have generational sort of wealth, they have generational access to top tier schools, like they get ski trips, I mean, it's everything you would want for every child to have. It's more than any child needs, actually. Right?
Yeah.
So when you mention, nobody's saying let's give these kids a hand, I actually say let's make sure these kids have everything the other kids have.
Mm.
I do some counseling at Concord Academy, which is an independent school just up the street from me.
Yeah.
And I'm there mostly to work with black and brown kids, for whom Concord is a big step, because they're coming from pretty different backgrounds. And I often say to the folks at Concord, I know you're pretty good in terms of, sort of scholarships and making it possible for these kids to come here, but it's not enough just to pay tuition because every day they're seeing their friends go downtown, and just pull out a platinum card, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying you need to give everybody a platinum card, but you're going to make things extremely hard for these kids if they can't participate in that, because that's part of what it means to be here. So give them a stipend, right? Make sure they can go down to McDonald's too, or Starbucks, or whatever it is the deal.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're creating this class difference within your school, and that's what
Yeah.
kids care about, right?
Yeah. Now, Frederick Douglass said this, and we're closing out. I don't want to take up all your time, but Frederick Douglass says it's easier to raise a strong kid than to repair a broken man.
That's right.
And we know in the field of psychology, right? This is validated because the more you get older, the more your brain becomes hardened, right?
That's
And that's why I love the verse when Jesus says you got to be reborn, and then Nicodemus says you got to be reborn. You got to go back into the stomach. No, you have to renew your mind. Like you have to go back to like a little kid and learn like little kids do, like you mentioned before, right? Have that humility. Um, how do you feel like we have, in order for us to have true diversity and equity, that we need to let a generation just pass and then just focus on teaching diversity and equity to kids?
Well, I think on a statistical macro level, we can see what's happening for quote unquote generations. But I think it's also so important to to not see the tree for the forest, right? Because there are trees that are thriving, right? There are kids that are getting just enough of what they need, who maybe have this or that talent, who are making it despite, the fact that generationally they've been subjugated, impoverished, etc. So the efforts that you're making, that the principals I was mentioning before, from the Lynch Leadership Academy are making, those things matter. I feel so lucky for whatever set of elements, allowed me to come through Dorchester, the way I did, in my upbringing. I have two folks who did not get, a decent education, who came from a really impoverished area of Central America, worked as a maid, worked as a cab driver, et cetera, et cetera, made some really good decisions. So, I mean, I want to say like two things at once. One is it's really unfair, what some people have to deal with. On the other is it is possible, right, to make it through anyway. And I think coming through that stuff, as hard as it is, and I don't wish it on anybody, like gives one a certain perspective, on what social justice is and what it isn't, and to just maintain hope that despite all the adversity, like we can give kids enough of what they need, to, as you say, like rework their minds and be defiant, of some of the scripts that have been imposed on them.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, man. But I got one last question.
Sure.
I'm big on history. How has history impacted your work?
Oh, the author's slipping my mind now. Maybe it'll come to me, but one of my favorite quotes goes something like, the past isn't dead, it's not even past, right? As I get older, I was telling this to my son the other day, I find myself thinking about time in sort of a different way. It's like every moment is in one moment. And especially as I go through what this country is going through right now politically, um, it's like this is what we've been doing from the beginning, right? It looks different, there are different characters playing out all this stuff, but there are certain things that are like just the same in terms of power, privilege, and oppression, in terms of institutions and structures that keep the same status quo in place, in terms of some of the theater that goes on between the political parties, even though in some ways they're too much alike. Um, so history for me, is sort of marking the episodes, of this dynamic that we just keep going through over and over again. And I'm not a scholar of world, sort of civilizations. Maybe there were some islands of culture and civilization that actually did it the ways that you and I are talking about now. But as I look around, the world and see some nations that have it far worse than we do, believe it or not, um, it seems to me that we're kind of stuck in a certain cycle of how not to do civilization. So I consider history to be a series of lessons and illustrations of how we get close and then how we miss it, how we try again, and then how we miss it. But I also think, particularly in America, and maybe in some ways for the whole human species, we
Yeah.
haven't been at it that long. Maybe we're on our way to a better place if we can just stay alive long enough to get there. We'll see.
Mm. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate the time, man. I mean, time is for human beings finite. So every time and every second that you spent with me, I definitely appreciate it, man. And I wish you nothing but the best.
Well, thanks. As I said earlier, it's not only an honor, but it's been a pleasure. It was, it's encouraging, actually to talk to you. I certainly do perceive the differences between me and others in terms of generation and age and all that.
Yeah.
And you are, a strong piece of evidence that, folks your age have not given up, are not just despairing, but you're trying to get out there and one, continue to learn, but also provide something for others. And I just wanted to tell you that I'm super, super grateful for that.
No, I appreciate you. One thing I will say, and I'll cut this part out, man, but I will say that you mentioned while you were talking that you came from a very religious background
Hmm.
and that you kind of veered away from the religion aspect of it. And I definitely have veered away from religion in my time. I was Christian. I grew up Christian. Then I became an atheist. But then after reading history, after
Mm.
reading history of all things, I started to go back to religion because I started to realize that like a lot of people's interpretation of the Bible comes from somebody else's interpretation. So
Hmm.
we will get the interpretation in our brain and then analyze the Bible through that interpretation instead of
Hmm.
coming from a clear deck and try to figure out, well, why is these individuals in history writing this book during that time?
Hmm.
I think that because I look at the Bible as more of a psychological book than a religious book.
Well, yeah,
Train.
one of the things, I mean, my wife is also not religious, but we tried to make sure that our kids, had a good grasp on what religion is and how some of their
Mhm.
friends move through the world, etc. So when you say the Bible is a psychological book, that resonates with me. It's a very important, and I think anybody's spiritual sort of baseline reading or whatever it is, that's such important stuff to have a grasp on. Not necessarily for any given individual to, what's the word, absorb or endorse, but to understand, right? And then to figure out what do we do with all these beliefs. And again, I tend to think of them as vehicles. And if they're safe vehicles, if they're not demanding that you take your vehicle off the road because only my vehicle can drive on this
Yeah.
road, then that's cool with me. I think so many religions have so much in common when it comes down to the bottom lines we've been talking about. It's just when folks start to think that they're a little bit entitled to say that theirs is the only one or the only way, etc., that I think we get into that thing of restrictivism, right? Only
Absolutely.
us, only our way, etc.
And the core of that belief is that it's just to understand. I think what people don't understand is that your beliefs are shaped, and especially back then, your beliefs are shaped by where you were born. So Hinduism is shaped by India. Like the geographical layouts of India shapes Hinduism. Confucianism, the geographical layouts shape Confucianism. But there's that bottom line that each civilization needs to survive. Because that's the bottom. I think that's the core, the pinnacle that we have to like have is that we all trying this to survive. The number one preservation of humans is survival. And those beliefs are supposed to aim towards that.
Well, I think that's right. It becomes a justification and sort of a north star for maintaining survival. I tend to think that we would all do better to realize the power of our survival driven behaviors, feelings, etc. And then, to decide what should we do with that? What's our purpose? Because currently, we're not going to be around forever, which
No.
means that each of us has to make a decision about what to do with our piece of, time on this plane. And in that way, not that, I'm a psychotherapist, I don't want people to hurt themselves, but we can choose anything actually to do with our lives. And I think it's that choice. I think it's the fear or the openness of that choice that leads people to look for a doctrine to live by.
Yeah.
And I guess personally, I prefer that we all think hard about it and come up with our own purposes and doctrines, and maybe they align with other stuff that's out there, and then share our thoughts with others and see what coalesces. And as maybe romantic as it sounds, or maybe even goofy, I think that's the way forward. What do you and I have in common? What are the identifications that we share versus the identities that are imposed on us? What do we
Yeah.
stand for, and how can we move things forward together?
I appreciate you, man. Thank you, man.
I
I might,
appreciate you too.
I'll be seeing you in the fall.
Looking forward to it.
All right, cool. Enjoy. Most God bless you, man.
Thank you.